Good afternoon, folks. We're gonna get started, so feel free to find a seat or stand in the back. I know it's 3 o'clock and people might have needs to stretch, have a little coffee. Thanks for making it to the end of the session, the end of the day with us. We've got a great conversation for the next hour with my esteemed panel here. This session is full steam ahead California legislative action, and we're going to dive into what the legislature accomplished in 2023 and in years prior on areas that include the corporate climate disclosure and transparency laws, the natural and working lands efforts that are now being implemented by the California Natural Resources Agency, and then some of the issues that have come up a lot during this conference in the voluntary carbon market world. So we're going to talk about those topics. Today, I'm Ross Zellin. I work for the California State Senate. I work as the principal consultant for the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies, which I think goes right up there in the longest and potentially worst named committees or titles in government that you could possibly have, because it's too many darn words to say I work on climate change. My role in Sacramento in the California State Senate is really just to help climate policy move forward. So I do work with a lot of our regulators, and then I work with our legislators. So whether it's working with my committee or my chair, Senator Henry Stern, or with other members who need some help on climate policy and implementation, I'm there and ready to serve. And so we've got a great team. We're going to kick it off and really focus on one of the big things. The reason why I'm here, I think this is why I was invited by NACW, is the climate disclosure laws from last year, Senate Bill 253 and 261. They were international and national and financial news to many, and it really a game changer. And we're going to be able to get to hear a little bit about the genesis and a little bit about the current status, including the legal challenge that is currently underway, and then we'll be able to dive in and also hear your questions, because I know a lot of people have questions. One of the things that we can do before I introduce my panel is just to get a good sense of who's in the room. If you are from the regulated community, if you might be falling under one of these corporate disclosure rules, would love you to raise your hand. Perfect, that's great. If you're in the space of working on the voluntary carbon market projects and that kind of stuff, if you raise your hand, and then we'll know. Yeah, I know. I see some friends, and so then we'll know who to kind of turn to when we get to the question and answer session. And so with that, I'm going to introduce my panel. At my farthest left is Stephen Rothstein. Stephen is the founding managing director for the Series Accelerator for Sustainable Capital Markets. The Series Accelerator really transforms the practice and policies that govern capital markets to accelerate reduction of the worst financial impacts of the climate crisis. And it's really seen through their direct advocacy work in Senate Bill 253 and 261. Stephen's decades of experience have been a real asset to the entire financial community. Previously, Stephen was a co-founder of the Citizens Energy Corporation, which was the only nonprofit oil company that the world has ever seen. Ran the New England market for Constellation's entry and expansion into the market as a successful electricity broker. And then his career also includes running other entities, the Perkins School for the Blind, Citizens Schools, and the JFK Library Foundation. And Stephen traveled all the way out to San Francisco for Somerville, Massachusetts. So we've got a really well-rounded person here. He's going to speak first, and then about both Senate Bill 253, 261, and give a little bit of presentation, and then I'll introduce the rest of my other two panelists now, so you know who they are. We've got Nico Van Alstyne from Shepherd Mullen in the Real Estate, Energy, and Land Use and Environmental Practice Group, right to my left here, right to your right. He's in the firm's San Francisco office and had a much shorter commute today than Stephen did.
On my bicycle.
Yeah, exactly. Walking the walk, riding the ride, and so his environmental compliance counseling practices focuses on climate change, brownfield redevelopment, sustainability, and other regulatory transactional matters. And he's represented many of the people in this room and at this conference over the past decades, including his really important work on the California Cap and Trade Program and AB 32 implementation. And his climate finance practice includes handling offset transactions, which we'll talk a little bit about today, marketing advice, and ESG counseling, which will certainly come up. We will all be grateful to get his counsel on some of these things. Through his work with AIDA, though, the International Emissions Trading Association, NECO has helped advance voluntary carbon market offsets and has handled matters in front of the state and federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court and many other administrative forum. In the middle, we've got Sydney Chamberlain, a project director for the Nature Conservancy, working on climate and nature-based solutions. Sydney and I shared a previous employer in the California State Senate, where she was a California Science Fellow, which is a really, really phenomenal program and makes the rest of us who weren't Science Fellows. I did a less prestigious fellowship, but I really ride on Science Fellows' coattails because Science Fellows actually know what they're talking about. Sydney worked in the Natural Resources and Water Committee, providing guidance to the senators. Sydney received a PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. In her research, she contributed to the first detections of gravitational waves, tiny cosmetic ripples that carry vital information about the contents and evolution of the entire universe. So that, if that's not exciting for what we're going to get into for the next hour, you've now got somebody who can tell you all about the universe. So I'm going to pass it over to Stephen in just a second, but for those of you who are maybe a little bit familiar of 253 and 261, I mean, this is really just the next iteration of California's climate leadership. We've got some, we are on the vanguard here, and so I was very honored and fortunate enough to work on it with folks like Stephen and the series team and many others who are at this conference, but this is really just the next stage of California's climate leadership, and so we're interested in learning about how that fits in, what is in the legislation and the new bills. How does it compare to what's going on in Washington D.C. with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and what's going on? How does it compare internationally with what's going on? So Stephen's going to take it from here and walk us through a little bit of a primer.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you not just for that and for hosting this and organizing it, but for your leadership. I mean, yours personally, your bosses, Senator Wiener's leadership. I mean, literally, we would not be here talking about this without him and his boss and the governor and others. So, I mean, and to understate how much California, for those of you from California may not kind of appreciate this, but the leadership that you have, that when the governor announced his plan to sign this, it was a climate week, and it was the buzz for the week. And at COP, it was discussed, and so it's really an example of amazing leadership. Again, there are many of you in the room that we've worked on this and would love to talk to others of you. I'm going to fly through these slides very quickly so we can get to the conversation, but if you want them later, give me a card or write down your name and email or something, and I'm happy to send them to anybody, so feel free to reach out afterwards. There are two companion bills that, while obviously they went through a separate legislative process, we view them as a package. And as you can see, 253 focuses on greenhouse gas emissions, and they're in a sense like what SEC has done, but actually a lot more, and I'll tell them more why it's more overall. And this focuses on Scope 1, 2, and 3 for the companies that are that are $1 billion or more in revenue, not just those here, but those doing business in California. So they can be based in any place in the United States. The estimate, and we're doing some deeper analysis now, is a little more than 5,000 companies, and it's fundamentally important. I mean, there are many countries that are already measuring these. In fact, France started in 2016, and others have been doing this for a while. Many other companies doing now because of ISSB. We can talk about that. But this is enormously important. Next slide, please. The companion bill, 261, that applies to a broader group. That's, again, $500 million or more, and that focuses on TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure, that has been rolled into the International Sustainability Standards Board. So the first one focuses on carbon mitigation, and the second one on practices from governance and risk management and other things. together they're very, very important. And you can't, if as a company, or as an investor, or as an employee, or a customer, you can't know where the problem is if you don't measure it. If you take the home example, if you only have so much time, do you fix the light bulb, or do you put weather stripping on the window? So this is kind of the corporate example. First, you have to understand the issue to know where to focus on it. These two bills, again, very thoughtful legislative effort, and can't thank legislators and their staff enough. Next slide, please. This just shows some of the advocates that are working on it, with deep thanks, again, to the legislative leadership throughout this process. These bills, they were 3 years kind of in the making, and with lots of people working hard. Next slide. And while some of the media is, but this is bad for business, in fact, that is incorrect. I mean, as H.L. Mencken once said, the famous writer and author, for every complex problem, there's a simple answer that's always wrong. There are some businesses that don't want more regulation, no matter what the topic is. But there are many that advocated for this. So the companies whose logos are reflected here, and many others, absolutely came, literally many of them actually came to Sacramento, some personally, some in writing or whatever, and said they want this. They've been doing this forever. Put it in context, 92% of Fortune 500 currently voluntarily disclose some kind of carbon emission, environmental, not everything that's in these bills, in the laws, excuse me. So these were just good business practices. And why do they do it? Because their investors want it. They know it makes good sense. It's fiduciary duty. Their customers want it. Their clients want it. Their employees want it. There's a study that shows that employees, that if they could choose between two companies and one was more reflective of their values, 41% of the people would move to that company. So that alone would make a big difference. Next slide, please. I think this is the last slide, and this just gives a little bit of a comparison. Again, we could spend the whole hour on this. I'm not. But just to put it in context, that a year ago, there were 8 countries that had some form of regulated climate disclosure. Today, there's an additional 15 that are going through the regulatory process. Some have completed their comments. Some are in their process, using the basis of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has now been, TCFD has merged in with them. Again, talk more about that piece of it. Europe goes further with CSRD. They look at, I'll just quickly, double materiality, where single materiality, again, I know many of you probably wrote the book on this, know more about this than I do, says what is the impact to the company. So for the SEC, for example, all they're authorized to look at in their enabling legislation is what is the climate impact on the business. Double materiality is what is the business impacts on climate. So Europe looks at both, goes a lot further, but this just highlights that there's a lot of, obviously the regulation has to be written, but a lot of potential interoperability, passportability, so to speak, and that California is a real leader. So with that, I think that's the last slide. You can take down the slides, and I will turn it back, unless I'm surprised. I think that's it. Turn it back to Ross.
Awesome. I just want, while we have this slide up, right, there's, so the SEC did their rule on March 6th. Yep. It was for most of the people in this room, you probably were paying attention, or you had friends paying attention. But for most of the rest of the world, it was between Super Tuesday and the State of the Union, right? It was done. There's no joke that it was probably done intentionally to try to kind of bury it within, because they largely split the baby, right? They took out Scope 3, which did not make the climate community and the advocates community happy at all, right? That was a disappointment, considering we literally just did it in California. And then at the federal level, the business community didn't like it. They've already sued over it. And that happened last Friday with the first lawsuit being filed in federal court. So, one of the things that I would like to I'll just ask Stephen real quick just to follow up on is, so at the national level, what is Ceres and your teams kind of thinking about how it all kind of pieces together, looking at this slide?
Sure. So first is, just to follow up, so we had our first meeting with the SEC in 2003, 21 years ago. So March 6th, it came out of the rule. It is imperfect at best. It doesn't cover Scope 3. There are a number of other things. We have stuff on our website. Happy to talk to you more about that. Since March 6th to today, there have been 9 separate lawsuits against the SEC, 7 who feel they went too far, 2 that feel from environmental groups they didn't go far enough. They're in 6 different jurisdictions. That will be the legal process. They will get consolidated into one. There's currently a stay. And Congress, since the 6th, has scheduled 3 congressional hearings. There was one on Monday. There was one earlier today and one April 10th. So we're focusing on defending the SEC both in court, in Congress. Actually, I'm flying tonight to go to speak at Congress tomorrow, in Congress, and because we think they're important. But they cover different things. I mean, the SEC covers all public companies, so it's about 7,800 companies, all public. The California legislation covers, again, estimates. We're doing a detailed analysis now, around 10,000, but roughly 2/3 are private. So those are not covered by the SEC, and it covers Scope 3. So it's not one or the other. We need both to move forward.
Awesome. Yeah, so, so I want to turn to Nico, and, one of the big things when we talk about what happened with 253 and 261, it was signed, but then in January, at the end of January, we had a lawsuit filed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and a number of other entities. And so that's kind of where the current landscape is, sure, the governor signed the bill, sure, things are moving in the positive direction, but now you've got this legal challenge over your head. And so, Nico, can you give us a little bit of the legal landscape of what the lawsuit against SB 253 and 261 are?
Sure. First, an additional note on the lawsuits filed against the SEC rule. Those 6 jurisdictions are the 2nd, 5th, 8th, 11th, and D.C. circuits. And just yesterday, the SEC initiated a lottery proceeding whereby a representative of each circuit gets together and they draw a hat as to which circuit will get all of them. And even though more than one suit was filed in the 5th Circuit, they only get one bean in the bucket. So we'll see. It'll be consolidated, which might or might not lessen the chance of the Supreme Court stepping in because of diversity of potential outcomes, because you'll have one court decision. We'll see. Obviously, stay tuned. So yes, the California lawsuit that was brought by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce against the California disclosure laws on January 30, it is really a novel lawsuit. At first blush, many of us actually kind of chuckled, but upon reading it, I think it's got some merit and it may have legs. The first and foremost complaint is that it violates the First Amendment, because it compels companies to make statements that are speculative and controversial and political. Query whether there's any merit to that, but that is the thrust of it. The 2 other claims, I think, don't have much legs now, but may come to have legs. The first is a supremacy clause, and it argues that the California laws are preempted by federal law, and that is normally the case. Federal law will, if it's there, it governs, not the state law. What they pointed to, remember this was filed on January 30 before the SEC rule was adopted. What they point to is the Clean Air Act, and they contend that these disclosures constitute regulating emissions, but of course they don't. They talk about disclosures about regulating emissions. So I think it's pretty weak in that regard, but that's their argument. They may have an argument about the SEC rule preempting it, but that's not ripe yet because we don't have implementing regulations yet. But keep that on the back of your minds. That could be an issue later on down the road. The other claim is the Dormant Commerce Clause claim, saying that California is attempting to regulate beyond its borders by forcing companies to make disclosures about their activities outside of the state. Again, I think that's probably pretty weak because they are operating in California by definition if they're under the law. So, but we'll see. So this is not the material of, the lawsuit is not the material, in my view, of a motion to dismiss. There's enough merit there to get it to summary judgment. It's early in the case. We'll see how it pans out. Switching to the status of the California disclosure laws now, so there's that cloud hanging over it in terms of the lawsuit, and that will take time to pan out. The more immediate issue is, I mentioned implementation. These laws are fairly brief. They're 6-7 pages. There's not a lot of detail. You compare that with the SEC rule, which is,
886. How many people have read them all?
It's a bit of a difference. And the aim there, like much of California's climate legislation, is to delegate to the agencies, primarily the California Air Resources Board, the ability to implement those laws and to develop implementing regulations. Particularly in the case of 253, the greenhouse gas emissions. That's the one that requires a lot of implementation issues. Well, what happened? You touched on this in January as well. The governor proposed his budget. California is facing a significant deficit and did not include funding for implementation of these bills. Now, that's just the beginning of the budget cycle. And Virginia Sahota, many of you heard this morning, made reference to the May revise, and they're cautiously optimistic that funding will be restored, or rather delivered, for these bills, for the implementation of these laws. That said, the schedule, and the governor did say this in his signing statement, one of his concerns was that the schedule is very, very aggressive and will put a big burden on ARB. And indeed, I mean, the basic outline was prepare the implementing regulations in 2024. Companies have to start reporting their emissions in 2025. Gathering data in accordance with those regulations in 2025, and then reporting in 2026. So and that's very aggressive. I mean, it takes normally minimum of 6 to 9 months for rulemakings to get through ARB. And they're very good, and Virginia this morning also said that they can do the LCFS and the cap and trade rulemakings this year, no problem. And I'm sure she would say that they could do these as well, no problem, if they have staff. But it's going to be very tough. And so it's hard not to think that schedule might slip a little bit. But we'll see. And then that brings us back to your first question about alignment with these other programs, both the federal program, the European program, and we should also note, just a few weeks ago, the 3 Chinese stock exchanges all adopted disclosure requirements. So, our main political rival, China, they're out ahead of us on this. They're requiring disclosures for companies that trade on those exchanges. So, and I don't know what their implementation schedule is, but there's a little bit of overlap, and all of these 3 are fairly close to each other, 2026 being the big year for most companies in most regimes, but we'll see how these 3 gel out. I'll stop there, but we can talk more.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nico. Yeah, and I think one of the other things that is fascinating about the bills, for those who are maybe know a little bit but not a ton about the legislation, is that the 253 scope 1 through 3 analysis, right, that's going to go through a full CARB rulemaking, and that'll go through the full process. And then 261 took a slightly different tact and a slightly different track, as if it just tells the reporting agencies, you are going to do your report aligned with the TCFD standards, and then you're going to submit it to the California Air Resources Board. And now there's definitely opportunities for the Air Resources Board to weigh in with some guidance, implementation manuals, those types of things. But there's 2 different tracks in terms of how it's going to be implemented. And so to me, as somebody who's the Attorney General is the one defending the laws and not the Senate, right? Where our job is now officially done. We are just interested bystanders at this point. But I'm interested to see how fighting the lawsuit will compare to how we've done the 2 laws on 2 tracks, and whether there's any interesting kind of outcomes on how the fact that we tried to do 2 different things will lead to either the same outcome or 2 different outcomes. I'm kind of interested to see that.
May I just throw in a little interesting factoid that I found really a very nice compliment as a way to California. I was at the COP, the Conference of the Parties, COP28 in Dubai. And there, the TFCD, Task Force on Climate Disclosures, made an unusual announcement. They're closing up shop. Their work is done. And I think it's because of California.
They're actually merging with ISSB. So they're closing as an entity, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures. It was started in 2017 by Mike Bloomberg and others, and as a voluntary efforts. And now it's been rolled into the International Sustainability Standards Board. So that's why it was so good this legislation says TCFD or its successors.
Right.
Because its successors really is the International Sustainability Standards Board. If you ever have a tongue twister and you want to say that 5 times fast, it's good exercise.
Seriously. Now, Sydney, this is a pivot, right? Where we've talked about the 2 climate disclosure bills, but there was a number of other bills that were listed on that program description that drew a lot of you into this room. It's around the voluntary carbon market space. And so, Sydney, as somebody who works in the VCM world, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit about what you're watching, a little bit around the dynamics around the VCM space, both from what the legislature is doing and also what the agencies are actually implementing from previous years.
Yeah, thanks, Ross, and hopefully you can all hear me okay. I was so glad to see that this session was at NACW because there's literally never a dull moment working on California climate policy, and that's certainly true today. So you just heard about SB 253 and 261, part of that 2023 legislative flurry, but there were 2 other bills from the 2023 legislative flurry that apply to the voluntary carbon market. There's one that was called Assembly Bill 1305, so that passed through the legislature and is now signed into law, and that involves disclosure requirements for both sellers of voluntary carbon offsets in California and buyers who purchase or use voluntary carbon offsets in California that make marketing emissions claims. And what are marketing emissions claims? Well, that's any kind of claim an entity makes about its emission reductions, about, oh, we're carbon neutral, oh, we're achieving net zero, we've significantly reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what we're talking about. And ultimately, this bill creates civil penalties for violations of the bill, and that can accrue quite a bit of fees. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what I found particularly interesting about AB 1305 is that unlike what we see with SB 253, this bill applies to any entity operating in California regardless of size. So in some sense, it actually has a much broader scope in terms of who it's going to apply to. And then another bill that relates to the VCM is SB 390, and this is a bill that scooted through the legislature, but was then subsequently vetoed by Governor Newsom. And this is a bill that would have made it unlawful to verify a voluntary carbon offset project, certify or issue credits for a voluntary carbon offset project, maintain such a project on a registry, or market or sell credits from a voluntary carbon offset project without having sort of significant disclosures and substantiation for those projects. And because of this unlawful part, ultimately this bill leads to what could be civil action both by the state and by citizens. And so in his veto message, which I wrote down because I found it very interesting, Governor Newsom said that by imposing civil liability for even unintentional mistakes about offset quality, this bill could inadvertently capture well-intentioned sellers and verifiers of voluntary offsets and risks creating significant turmoil in the market for carbon offsets, potentially even beyond California. And I think that's certainly true. We've talked in this panel, you've heard in other panels and other sessions at this conference about California's leadership in the space. So with this bill, there's really a possibility of creating precedent here. And while this particular bill was vetoed, it was reintroduced this year as Assembly Bill 1036. And actually, one of my colleagues, who is sort of our TNC's lead on AB 1036, wasn't at this conference because she's today at the Senate testifying to the Senate Environmental Quality Committee about that bill. And I think what's interesting about sort of this new version of SB 390, AB 1036, is that last year at the same time, the policy committees hadn't necessarily received a lot in terms of letters in support and opposition, but today is the first policy committee hearing this bill, and there already has been quite a bit of letters coming in to the point where I think the committee wasn't even able to capture them all in their analysis. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with those 2 bills.
Yeah. Yeah, and many of you have stopped me in the halls and asked for an update on what's going on with 1036 because it is so impactful and so disruptive to what you are trying to do with your projects and your investments and your forward-looking plans. And so, I think that just as I've said to many of you, the most important thing is to engage, right? Today's hearing was this morning. The bill passed through committee. It will now go to the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is another opportunity to engage with committee staff and the committee chair, and ultimately because both SB 1036 and also AB 1305, which Sydney talked about both, they're ultimately bills that are going to be basically hashed out in the courts, right? These are bills that ultimately are going to be lawyers are going to then go and file lawsuits based on what they see claims and veracity and those types of things. And so ultimately, I think the Judiciary Committee is actually a very important part of this hearing process for this bill, because ultimately the Judiciary Committee needs to make decisions about the role of the judiciary in this resource. Is this the appropriate fora for the voluntary carbon market space, which is one, very much a developing space, two, already overburdened, and if you file a civil lawsuit today, you'll be lucky to get a hearing in 2 years, or you're lucky to start your lawsuit in earnest in 2 years. In many places. So
yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right, Ross. And I mean, if we step back and think a little bit, what's the difference between the compliance market and the voluntary carbon market? They're not the same, right? And I think, the voluntary carbon market is a really important opportunity, first of all, to road test new protocols, but also to bring in project developers and landowners who otherwise may not really have an incentive to undertake this kind of project. And there really is a lot to think about. When you think about passing sort of liability around this to courts, you run the risk of disincentivizing these project developers because of fear of these lawsuits that ultimately are going to be under these subjective sort of decision-making processes. And so the question is, who should we really be leaving those questions to? And I think that's something I'd encourage everyone in here to maybe be thinking about. Is the court the right decision maker, or is there another entity that perhaps maybe could contribute?
Yeah, and for those of you who are really passionate about this space, right? Which I really appreciate everybody's passion. I think one of the things to communicate to the committee staff, to the author's staff, whatnot, basically, what I've seen from the author's statements, the bill analyses, other things, other documents that have been put out, both about 390 and about 1036, is, they are now bringing the VCM space into what the state uses for what we call the false advertising or misleading statements, right? It's applying the same standard, right? And so I think what they are looking for from this community and from other stakeholders are, tell us exactly why we shouldn't be applying the same standards statewide that we do for other greenwashing or other misrepresentation to the VCM space. And I think that there's many of you who can make a really good case to why it doesn't apply or why there should be a different level. It's a commodities contract. I've heard lots of other great explanations just over the last 24 hours walking the halls and talking to you all. But I think that now it's like we need to now you all need to make that case very clearly and concisely to the author's office and to others, because I think they're open into listening. I think that the real question is that they just need to hear it from you all in the community. That was my takeaway with my conversations with the author's office in the last few days before coming here.
I think so. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how AB 1036 plays out in this legislative session. But I think also the implementation of AB 1305 is going to implement, we're going to be facing these legal battles, and ultimately they're kind of going to be a tug and war in a way between these as they play out.
Yeah. So
AB 1305 is going to be tweaked this year. Gabriel, the assemblyman who introduced the bill, he issued a letter saying, "Oh no, I meant for it to go into effect in 2025, not 2024." On the books, it went into effect January 1 of this year. So he's introduced AB 2331, which will include some tweaks. We don't know yet what those tweaks are, but we expect to see it soon. A number of folks have have engaged with his office and have made suggestions about how a number of the troubling ambiguities in 1305 could be clarified. In my view, in my experience here at this conference, most folks in the voluntary carbon world are eager to have greater transparency and welcome the thrust and purpose of 1305. But there are, as I say, troubling ambiguities that could create liability that really should be cleaned up.
And just to clarify for those of you who don't watch the California legislature as like the rest of us, an author can introduce what we call a spot bill or an intent bill before the deadline, and then work with stakeholders and others to then refine it, and then right before the deadline to amend can then throw in their amendments. And so that's when Nico says we're going to see the language soon. It's that he's right. No one except for the author's office knows what's in it, and it's probably changing on a Word document as we speak. And so, until that deadline, no one knows, and then it goes into print, and then we all get to kind of respond to it and work from that once it goes into its first policy committee hearing. And it's absolutely true, everything Nico said in terms of the fact that I think between the governor's office and implementing this, the legislature and implementing it, and the stakeholders, I feel like there's going to be positive momentum. And there seems to be already a significant work between October, after Governor Newsom signed the bill, just to today. It seems like there's been a lot of channels that have been opened up, a lot of stakeholders have engaged, and I think we're making positive movement here. One of the things also I wanted to just talk about is how does this kind of all work in tandem, right? I'm asking Nico, Stephen, when we talk about, investor confidence and the regulated entities that you're working with on a day-to-day, are we seeing are we seeing a focus on California from a different perspective in terms of the financial world, in terms of how people are now looking to California? Now, one of the reasons I'm mentioning this is, and I'll tee Stephen up with this, is that the SEC regulation made reference to California 83 times, I believe. It was if I'm remembering my exact number well. So now all of a sudden, California is really playing ground zero for the financial community, and I'm interested to hear what your clients or your investors are kind of seeing and talking about in this space.
Yeah, so first, just put it in perspective. Do investors care about this? Absolutely. What investors want, and whether you're talking individuals thinking about, the 401k, or these big institutional investors with trillions and trillions of dollars, they want to have better information. And for most of them, they're not thinking of the next just quarter, they're looking at the next quarter century. Because the average person who's working in the United States today is going to retire in 23 years. So you're thinking about what's the world going to be like in 23 years? And if you're a fiduciary thinking about managing their retirement, you better be thinking about the risk, physical risk, transition risk, those. So we actually did an analysis of investor comments submitted to the SEC. And again, a lot of those would have been similar to California, that 98% supported Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. 100% supported TCFD alignment. So there's broad support for this, and they are looking at California, absolutely. That California is leading the way, and that there is a extreme amount of interest in the next steps with the budget, for the state and CARB. And I'll just say now, at the end of this, if any of you want to get involved who are not involved, come see me afterwards. We'd love to have your voice involved with this, get your insight and your expertise. Because investors, and we're not just talking California investors, but across the country are asking. I was literally on a call about 2 hours ago, and I said I was at this conference. What's happening? What's happening in the legislature? What are the governors doing, et cetera? What's CARB going to do? I know I'm going to be asked tomorrow on Capitol Hill. So it is very much, investors want to understand. And investors have choices. They can decide to put their money in other places. When the SEC, just as historical context, they started 91 years ago. When they started, not that exact year, but early on, they did this very radical thing. They said, we should have audited financial statements. Now, back then, it was considered radical because the people who opposed it used the same arguments that people who didn't want climate disclosure in California or the SEC. It's too hard. It's too complicated. It's too expensive. It's going to share our competitive secrets. Well, today, obviously every public company, but most private, medium and large-sized private company have audited statements. Why? Because the market demands it. I predict in the next few years the same thing on climate, because climate is a financial risk. It is, and I can give you lots of statistics. We all know them. We don't need to spend time on that. So, and people are looking at what California is doing on this area. So again, can't thank folks for Ross and everyone else for the leadership, and encourage all of you. Many of you are already very involved, and if not, would love to engage you.
Well, I'll just say, as someone who's not going to be able to retire in the next 23 years, and this is important for all of us, but especially those of us who are not going to be retiring in the next 23 years. Nico, over to you, and then also I'd love to hear what the conversations are around the progress that the companies that you've worked with on TCFD reporting. Right, there is a history. There's a 6-year, 7-year progress of reporting. What are some of the lessons learned and that you think that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, don't think I can really speak that fully to that particular question. Because when folks are reaching out to me, frankly, they're the ones that are waking up to this, not the leaders. That, your larger, more sophisticated companies already have staff. So guess what? They don't hire me. So it's the second tier companies that are now realizing, oh, we've got to do this too, and so they're trying to figure it out and find their way. And that totally makes sense. That's the way the world works. And there is great interest. There is great interest in this. You asked a question earlier about how do these things sync up? How do the disclosure requirements fit with the voluntary carbon market? Because really, they're on their faces, they're not obviously related. Well, why is that? It's because when required to make disclosures about one's emissions and one's climate risk and how one's going to address that risk, many companies, and the language in the complaint, by the way, by the Chamber of Commerce is very clear about this. They're concerned about activists suing them because of what they've said and what they've been forced to say. So they'd rather keep it secret, right? So when they have to come out and publicly make these disclosures that are of keen interest to investors or anybody, they want to be able to tell a better story, right? They want to be able to say, okay, we've made all of these efforts to reduce our emissions. We're doing all of these efficiency improvements, but there are some final emissions that we cannot avoid. So what are we doing about those? Because we do appreciate that the climate crisis is real. Well, we are purchasing offsets to ensure that there are, in fact, this has also become controversial, particularly in Europe, but to make a net zero claim, to be able to say, we've reduced everything as much as we can, and we've covered the rest through carbon credits. Okay, so that puts the focus immediately, that draws attention to the voluntary carbon market. And I want to just throw out one thing. The voluntary carbon market has been getting so much concentrated negative attention in the last 2 years. Many of us are deeply familiar with this and angst-ridden about it. So I'm not going to go into that. But so there are efforts to improve and enhance the integrity and credibility of the market on both voluntarily and through some regulatory action, such as the CFTCs. We heard from Chairman Benham this morning. And I just wanted to point to one potential way that can be done here in California. Under SB 261, Section 38533B5 states that, quote, to the extent a climate-related financial risk report, that report that you got to put out, contains a description of a covered entity's greenhouse gases or voluntary mitigation of greenhouse gases, the state board may consider covered entities' claims if those claims are verified by a third-party independent verifier, unquote. So that's an invitation to ARB to provide guidance in its regulations as to what sort of carbon credits verified by a third-party verifier will meet its standards. And if it's good enough for ARB's reporting, then it should be good enough to defend a greenwashing lawsuit. So I think that will serve these roundabout way. These disclosure laws are driving interest towards the carbon credits market, the voluntary carbon market, but they're also providing indirectly, I hope, a safe harbor, a protection for ensuring that these are good credits. Yeah, there are bad credits out there, but these are credits that meet those standards and are defensible.
Well, thank you for calling that specific section out, which most people do not know about. They don't, and certainly complex, right? But that's the exact idea: is that how did things start interlinking and protecting and continuing that forward momentum that you all in this space have been building. I know we've only got about 15 minutes left for the section. I want to ask Sydney one more question, but start thinking about your questions for our panelists here. We'll have a mic coming around. But one last topic, changing topics, but only halfway. Sydney, you work a lot on the natural and working land space. In 2022, we passed AB 1757. Right now, it's in implementation phase over at the California Natural Resources Agency. What's going on there? Where do you see that fits in with this entire conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I love this question, and I get excited. I'm like moving to the front of my chair. So just to contextualize AB 1757 a little bit more, it's helpful to maybe step back and think about the process that California used to really set goals and benchmark progress toward its climate goals through different sectors. This happens through a process we call the scoping plan, which is like a big crazy word, but ultimately what this involves is a whole bunch of modeling for different sectors, including the natural and working land sector, but also transportation and clean energy, clean tech. And every 5 years, the California Air Resources Board has to go and update this plan, which is ultimately California's blueprint for climate action. And this plan was first launched through AB 32, this pivotal legislation that took place back in 2006. So we've gone through several iterations of this plan. But ultimately, the natural and working land sector has kind of always been like the redheaded stepchild of sectors in the plan. And it's never really been considered on par with things like clean energy, with transportation, with building decarbonization. And so there's been a big push for many years by many advocates, by scientists, by researchers to think about natural and working lands. And why? Well, first of all the work you're doing around carbon markets requires nature to work, right? But we also know from looking at California that historically the state's land served as a net sink of carbon. And what we're finding is that because of development pressure, wildfire, impacts of climate change that are escalating, our lands are not only losing their ability to be a sink of carbon, but actually the science shows they're becoming a net source of emissions. And so in fact, if we don't intervene and actually do something now, we not only risk the ability of our lands to help us in doing things like putting together offset projects, but frankly, we're going to have them become a source of emissions that's going to hinder us more in tackling climate change. So it's really important to think holistically as we're addressing climate change about this natural and working land sector. And the Air Resources Board, the Natural Resources Agency, and the state of California has really started to think about that as well. And so the 2022 scoping plan, which is the most recent iteration of this blueprint, actually for the first time included extensive modeling for the natural and working land sector. And I wanted to take a moment to just underscore the leadership that California has shown in doing this, by the way, because to my knowledge at least, no other government or entity has done this kind of extensive modeling for the natural and working land sector. And it's not easy. It's not like you can, with tailpipe emissions, that's one thing. You kind of can see what's coming out of tailpipe. It's very hard when you're thinking about ecosystem carbon flux and across many different kinds of ecosystems. So tremendous leadership by the California Air Resources Board in doing that modeling and putting together a target in their 2022 scoping plan for the sector. But of course, we know that the first time you put something together, I think the last session someone here said, how many of you still have a first generation iPhone? And I love that example because it's true. It's like the first time we do something, we know we're going to have to keep doing work. In California, one of the beauties of this state is that it's really like a policy laboratory where we have a chance to road test climate solutions, to build upon them, to improve them, and to course correct when we need to. And so AB 1757 is really an effort that captures that spirit. The goal of AB 1757 is to go to the work in the scoping plan where we have these new targets for the natural and working land sector, but that had a few gaps. So for example, if you think about different ecosystems in California, some of you might be interested in things like blue carbon, but coastal wetlands weren't included in that plan. Changes or improvements in forest management were included in that plan. So there's a few gaps, and AB 1757 seeks to remedy that. And it requires, or I should say required, because now it's been in the implementation phase, the Air Resources Board to collaborate with the Natural Resources Agency and other state agencies to come up with a set of ambitious targets for the natural and working land sector. And why is that important? Because we know that targets drive action. And without targets, it's easy to just say, oh, that's something that's nice to have. So these agencies convened, as required by the bill, an expert advisory committee that involved scientists, researchers, policy experts, and that group met consistently throughout 2022 and put together a set of recommendations. And now we're all waiting very eagerly and excitedly for the Natural Resources Agency to release this set of targets. So I wanted to share that bill because it is something important that touches on this space. And I may be saying something a little bit too spicy saying this at NACW, but when we think about our climate goals here, both the compliance market, the voluntary carbon market, they're wonderful tools for helping us to scale and accelerate climate action. But they are, of course, just a couple of the tools in the toolbox, right? And when we think about intervening on California's natural and working lands, thinking about holistically the way that we think about our ecosystems and incorporating nature and climate action, there are other tools we need to think about too. And so this is an important bill that not only will impact the carbon market space, but ultimately hopefully drive action forward to protect and support nature in our natural and working lands.
I personally don't think it's spicy because we all exist in nature. We all have our favorite wetlands or our favorite mountains or our favorite areas that we'd like to go explore, and protecting them and enhancing them has really got to be the goal. Because as you're saying, the momentum is not in our favor when it comes to the climate impacts of our actual working lands, the natural working lands. questions? We got one right there. Perfect.
Hi, Denise Cathy, Argus Media. So one of the things ARB said this morning was, we can no longer pretend that things that are affecting the voluntary carbon market don't affect the compliance market. And so while we've been discussing how these bills will affect the voluntary carbon market, are y'all hearing anything in your spheres about how this could affect compliance offsets?
Yes, and simply put, a concern. There's really not much more to say than that. There is concern, as Regina Sahota said, there's a thought that the same kinds of claims, and these claims about fraud in accounting, which all come from a few sources, have applied to compliance projects as well. Not the target has not been solely on the voluntary market, and so if you can have a cause of action under one of these new laws to go after someone who makes statements about a voluntary project, well, why not do the same thing with regards to a compliance project? It's going to have the same potential impact. So people are concerned.
I'll just add one of the things that we talked about a little bit in our joint legislative hearing last week was looking at the climate disclosure bills and how they all they're all interweaving. Just as Nico was talking about Section 5 of SB 261, of how that could chart a path forward for high quality compliance offsets post 2030. It's got to all work together. We're not saying we're doing it. We're not saying we're not. But we have to think broader about how we can potentially provide some good, high-quality metrics to compliance offsets to address the criticisms and also move forward on something that we know is an important tool in the tool belt.
Hi, Robert Maddox at N-Value. Thanks for a great presentation. Now, you're mentioning with disclosure, we keep talking about offsets, and when I looked at the bill, I was curious to know RECs. They seem to be silent on them, but it's scope 2. So under the California law, do you have to disclose RECs and your REC usage? And are all RECs good, unbundled, PPA, through the utility?
You want to take a shot?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that would go to your SB 261 disclosures, and those aren't as specified. I mean, it's whatever your strategy is for addressing your risk, and if that includes RECs, then you could say that. But there's no, unlike 253, where you have more granular numerical kinds of requirements. Under 261, it's more narrative, it's more qualitative, and people would have discretion as to what they want to say about that.
Yeah, I guess we would expect, this is just me, not that in the rulemaking process there might be more information on that issue. It's also interesting to note in the SEC rule that came out on March 6th, there is extensive conversation about the RECs. They have to be specifically identified in there as well in the financial statements.
Having spent 30 years practicing law in California, a recovering lawyer, and having spent 8 hours on the plane from D.C., where I've relocated, coming to this conference yesterday, I have a federal question and a state question for the panel. And thanks to Craig Ebert and NACW for a wonderful conference, and especially to my former employee, Ross Zellen, who worked at the law firm that I practice at. I asked this morning, not so articulately, assuming the president is the Democratic nominee, how does that change things? Assuming the president is the Republican nominee, how does that change things? So I'd like to know from each of you, how is that driving your policy-making, decision-making, your need to put in safeguards to not have the shock that we had in 2017 when nobody expected what happened would happen, and we ended up kind of cobbling together something. And I, as a vice chair of LEDWP, as a commissioner, ended up being one of the people doing that. So I'm interested in hearing from you your prediction of the future, whether we have a one or the other. Maybe it's Robert Kennedy, who knows?
I'm happy to kick it off. So I won't, in my official capacity, voice an opinion of what I want, but I'll just say that we're excited that the SEC has moved forward where they did, because to get the court stuff started, there will likely be a vote in Congress in April to review it. So we want to get that in place either way. But that's also another reason why California is so important. That in 2017, when the then president, I'll say Voldemort for other reasons you can imagine, not to be mentioned, pulled us out of Paris, Ceres and a lot of other people, including a lot of people in this room, started the We're Still In. And cities and companies and counties said, we're still involved with Paris. I can imagine a similar initiative that if there is an administration that says climate change isn't real, that there would be a very active voice from cities, states, private sector to stay engaged in those areas, including disclosure. And that's another reason why California's leadership is so important.
You know, I would just like to add to that. I mean, the first thought that came to my mind is California's leadership. And I also don't necessarily want to say, you know, who I think will or won't win. I don't think my prediction is the most important. But I do think that California's leadership is pivotal in these moments. And I'm actually remembering a moment, I can't remember what year it was, 2017, that's all a blur, kind of before the pandemic, right? There was a time when the president, who shall not be named, visited California and was meeting with our members of our Natural Resources Agency. And our Natural Resources Secretary, Wade Crowfoot, was engaging with the president, who said something to the effect of, it's going to cool off, just you wait. And our Natural Resources Secretary, Wade Crowfoot, said, I wish the science agreed with you. And I think the strength that California has is it is a state that values having science-informed policy, and that is so critical. The fact that California is willing to be a leader in this space time and time again is something that we're going to have as we move forward in these uncertain times.
I would just echo what they said. Really nothing more to add. I will say this. I just recently got a notice that I've been 7 years at my firm, Shepherd Mullen, which is a global firm, but it's a California-based firm, and most of our offices are in California. And it was 7 years ago, in early 2017, that I switched from an excellent environmental law firm, which was headquartered in Washington, D.C., and focused primarily on the federal government, to a California-based law firm. And that's because California is going to continue to show that leadership regardless. But we are only one of 50, so it's a very important vote in November.
And I'll just add to say that I think, the administration, both the legislature itself, we work in our own capacities. Oftentimes we're able to coordinate and learn from other state legislators, other states that are trying interesting policy. That's the old saying, right? That states are the laboratories for democracy. Our governor and his administration do a great job of working with other states, but I think that one of the things that I want to see more of, regardless of what happens in 2024 in November, is that we continue to work on some of the thornier issues around cross-state issues, right? When it comes to our energy sector, we have import issues, we have export issues. We need to work well with our neighbors and the whole West and the whole Western grid, regardless of who's the governor in the other states. We have to work well with those. We have to also think about what other states we import things like our gas from, and how are we getting it? Are we working as well as we could be with those places to help reduce the methane leaks, flaring and venting from our suppliers, and thinking about one of the benefits of both 253 and 261 is we're going to start seeing this data where we are popping the hood on these companies and on the people who make our world go round. And now we can start to kind of dive in and say, here's where some of the trouble spots are, and we can actually then smartly deploy resources and smartly deploy budget dollars here in the legislature to our agencies to go after and tackle those thorniest problems as we do the transition to kind of a clean energy economy and a net zero economy. Because it really does not matter ultimately what happens at one state. We have to do it all together. California's leadership, her words echoed three straight times. I'm going to echo it a fourth time, but I'm going to say that we need to work well with others, regardless of what we do alone. We can go further together.
Thank you.
One last question, yeah.
Joan Pinto, Carbon Pulse. You mentioned the assurance of Sahota this morning about the receiving, budget dollars. What if these programs, these bills do not receive the budget dollars? Then what?
So I'll take the question as the person who works in the legislature. I have tremendous confidence that that these programs are going to get the dollars. We have had excellent interactions with the administration to make sure that it's going to be in part of the May revise. I don't think you would have heard from my colleagues at the California Air Resources Board with the words that they used today, with such clarity and such definitiveness if they weren't certain. And so I feel like over the next 3 to 4 weeks, you're just going to see the details, but everything is really trending in the positive direction.
It helps that Senator Weiner, the sponsor of SB 253, was named the head of the Senate Budget Committee.
Yeah. What he said.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on that comment around budget dollars. When I think about the sequencing of LCFS rulemaking, cap and trade rulemaking, and regulatory disclosure, how do you sort of see those being addressed by ARB?
I think Rajinder said it best this morning that they can do it all at the same time. I mean that there's no expectation that they can't do multiple things at the same time. I think the most important thing that we in the legislature can do to help the Air Resources Board is to go get them that funding. Go get them that money, make the deal happen, and I will say one of the interesting things about when we talk about the funding, right? This is a self-funding program, right? The compliance entities that are going to have to file, they're going to file and they're going to pay a filing fee, and so this won't cost the state money in the long run. This program will pay for itself, and for your companies that have annual revenues of over $500 million or $1 billion, they're really not going to see it. This is going to be a rounding error or less than what they spend on pencils. Just to submit the fee, and so the nice thing is this program is going to pay for itself. So that's just one key thing. We're not always going to be fighting over the budget. This is money just to start getting the program launched. Hard to hire staff if on an IOU or a loan. You have to actually have money in hand to be able to hire staff. When it comes to the schedule, I would really defer to what Rajinder said this morning. I have utmost confidence that they're going to be able to do multiple things at the same time. And quite honestly, learning the data from the stakeholders, from the entities who are going to be reporting as they do the public process for 253, I think actually could potentially help with what we see in 2025 and 2026 and beyond as we iterate on all of our rulemakings, not just LCFS and cap and trade, but also our MRR, our mandatory reporting requirements, and other things that we're already doing to try to gather data from reporting entities. Cool.
Maybe one follow-up question. Is there anyone in the legislature that opposes extension beyond 2035?
Probably. So his question was, is there anyone in the legislature that opposes extension beyond 2030 for cap and trade? This conversation not really focused on cap and trade. I don't really. First of all, I do not. I'm. This is not appropriate for me to comment on it. It's not. And it's not really. And we also don't know. So that's really the answer to that question. And ultimately, I think the best thing, if you're thinking about the future of the carbon market in the state of California, the best thing you can do is learn from our history. It was not that long ago that we voted on both AB 32 and then SB 32 and all the companion legislation. See who's still there. See who's working in the building. See who's working in Sacramento, and go and talk to us. Come and talk to us. If you have issues, if you have thoughts, we want to hear. We really, really are here to learn from you all. This is a dynamic and moving space, and we do best when we hear from you all.
I wrote a memo for AIDA that was submitted to IEMAC the year before last on the 2030 issue. So I actually, and no one was willing to take it up at that time in the legislature. I suspect that will change soon because people are making investments, buying these allowances and such with an eye. You can't buy these things thinking the program's going to go poof 4 years out. So that's very much on the minds, I think, of a lot of legislators. I do expect it to be picked up, and our memo provided, I think, a very defensible roadmap for how the legislature can do that.
Awesome. I know we're at time, so I want to say thank you to you all who stayed, and thank you to my wonderful panelists who gave a lot of themselves to do this today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.